I'm David Goodman, and I'm here to talk to you about the European Chess Team Championship finals, which were played in Moscow in 1977. The event was held from the 14th to the 23rd of April, with teams competing from England, West Germany, USSR, Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. In order to play in this event, England had to qualify ahead of Wales and Holland, which in itself is no mean achievement. The England team consisted of, in order, Keane, Hartston, Steen, Nunn, Mestel, Whiteley, Webb, Bellin, Spielman and Goodman. Originally Rumans was scheduled to play board 10, but had to drop out due to other commitments. I was in California at the time, partly having holiday but mainly playing in an international tournament at Lone Pine, which included 15 grandmasters. I received a telegram asking me to play, and thanks must go to Paul Boswell and especially to Sir Stuart Milner Barry for their help in getting me a visa at very short notice. The final scores were as follows: USSR 41.5, Hungary 31, Yugoslavia 30, Romania 29, Bulgaria 25, West Germany 25, Czechoslovakia 21.5, and England 21. This result may seem rather disappointing, even in view of the fact that we were aware before the tournament that we would be heavily outgraded and outclassed by some of the teams. However, this view fails to take into account the following factors. Firstly, the oldest member of our team was 29, the youngest 19, and the average age 24. These figures speak for themselves. The English team has 20 years in front of them, and nobody knows how many strong players or grandmasters we can obtain in the next few years. All the other teams were at least 10 years older than us, on average, and the Russian press frequently remarked on the promise of the team. Secondly, we must take into account the strength of the opposition in relation to our own results. The individual results were as follows: Keane, 2 out of 6, Hartston, 2 out of 7, Steen, 2.5 out of 6, Nunn, 3.5 out of 7, Mestel, 2 out of 6, Whiteley, 1 out of 6, Webb, 4 out of 7, Webb narrowly missed winning a board prize, Bellin, 2.5 out of 6, Spielman, 1 out of 3, and Goodman, a half out of 2. The team consisted of 10 players, but in each match only 8 played. Ray Keane played a Category 14 tournament against an average rating of his opponents of 2600 and had to play black against both Karpov and Portish, whilst on board 2, Hartson had to contend with Petrosian, Ribley, Georgiou, Tringov, Flager, Jansa, and Gligorich. Many of the other teams were able to field strong grandmasters all the way down. And the 2 games I played on board 8 were against Popov of Bulgaria, who has 1 grandmaster norm, and Sveshnikov of the USSR, who is rated 2520 and recently came very high in the Soviet Championship. Thirdly, whatever the rights and wrongs of his action in choosing to play instead in Brazil, the absence of Tony Miles proved to be a great handicap to the English team, who might well have avoided 8th place had he been playing. However, it is clear that the England team was not really outclassed anyway, as we only came half a point behind Czechoslovakia, while both Nunn and Webb put up excellent performances, and maybe in a few years we'll be able to score highly against any of the teams playing in this competition. It was of course rather interesting to see Moscow, and probably one of the best ways to see the Soviet Union is to go as a guest of the Soviet Chess Federation. We were given free time in which to look around, but I don't think I ever quite got over the culture shock of going from San Francisco and Los Angeles to Moscow. Of course, this is a chess tape and not a political tape, but I think that people might be interested to hear of an incident that occurred during the event. Ludek Pachman is now a West German citizen and was playing board 5 for West Germany at the tournament. Originally he was a Czechoslovak, and in 1968 spoke out against the Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia. He was imprisoned for a number of years, and when released wrote a book called Checkmate in Prague, and gave a number of speeches about his experiences and about world politics in general. The Russians seemed rather embarrassed by his presence, and people like Pachman and Korchnoi, who recently defected from the Soviet Union, tend to be mentioned extremely rarely, if at all, in Soviet and East European sources. In round two, the Czechoslovakian team defaulted their game against Pachman, presumably under instructions from a higher authority. It was rather interesting to play chess in Russia because chess is the national sport in Russia, and there's great interest shown by the general public. There was always a very full crowd of people who came to watch the tournament, and even the opening ceremony, where we were presented with a sort of chess ballet to open the tournament. Anatoly Karpov, the world champion, again showed his excellence by scoring 100% in the 5 games he played. He's very, very popular in Russia. However, the crowd get very excited when he's winning games and create too much noise. When I was playing Popov of Bulgaria, I was playing board 8, and I was right next to the crowd. He was sort of in the middle of the hall, and I had to make about 4 or 5 moves in a minute, and so I was forced to look up at the crowd and say something in rather strong terms, which they presumably interpreted as a plea for them to be quiet. But this only lasted for about a minute, and then they started making a lot of noise again. So this is one of the problems of playing in a country where chess is so popular. Anyway, Karpov's result was incredibly impressive, and what was even more impressive was that he played all his games very, very fast. He was spending an hour and a half over 40 moves as opposed to 2.5 in a lot of his games, and so his games are coming to a climax at about the 3.5 hour, 4 hour stage. But some of his opponents seemed very psyched at having to play him, and they played very passively and rather inaccurately. And so some of his games, well, if it can be put like this, they seemed relatively easy compared to some of the games he's had to play at previous events. Just before the event in Moscow, a number of the games in the candidates qualifying for the World Championship were finished. And in one of these matches, Portish beat Larsen. So Portish is now one of the 4 remaining candidates who can challenge Karpov for the World Championship. We're now going to look at the game Portish against Karpov. But in this game, it's not very impressive. Portish seems very psyched, plays very, very passively the whole game. And if there's anything to go by, then he's little hope for a challenge in 1978. In chess, there seems to be a process whereby when someone gets to the top, he stays there for a few years, but then somebody else rises to challenge him and eventually passes him. It could be argued that Karpov rose to meet the challenge of Fischer, but at the moment it seems as if no young player anyway is rising to meet Karpov, and if his results in Moscow and recently are anything to go by, it seems as if he should win the World Championship next year. However, it's not clear how he'd do against Korchnoi in a match. Okay, so now we're going to look at 2 games of Karpov's, the first being Portish of Hungary against Karpov. Portish is white. 1, knight to king's bishop 3, and black played knight to king's bishop 3. 2, pawn to king's knight 3, pawn to queen's knight 3, bishop to knight 2, bishop to knight 2, castles, pawn to king 3. White plays 5, pawn to queen 3. Black plays pawn to queen 4. White plays 6, queen's knight to queen 2. Black plays queen's knight to queen 2. And white plays rook to king 1. Well, I don't know what you think about this, but White's fifth and seventh move looked rather passive because, well, evidence has shown that Karpov is very, very strong with White when he's got slight advantages, sort of building them up. And it's like Portish is giving away his advantage of having the white pieces to Karpov. I think Portish should have played pawn to queen 4 and pawn to queen's bishop 4, about moves 5 and 6, and go into a queen's Indian, which is the kind of position where White can retain a slight edge for a long time. Anyway, Karpov now played 7, bishop to queen's bishop 4. This is a very good idea. Usually people play bishop to king 2 here. This is a rather more aggressive move. It's much more fluid. Portish now played 8, pawn to bishop 4, which I again think is bad because it's rather inconsistent. If he's played rook to king 1, he should then aim for pawn to king 4. Karpov now castled, and pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. Portish now played knight to knight 3, and Karpov played bishop to queen's knight 5, which is superior to bishop to queen 3. Portish was now forced to play bishop to queen 2, and Karpov played pawn to queen's rook 4. This is a very ambitious move, and Karpov played this very quickly. Portish now played knight on queen's knight 3 to queen 4, and Karpov played rook to king 1. White played queen's rook to bishop 1, and black played pawn to bishop 4. White played knight to bishop 5, and Karpov played knight to bishop 1, which is either heading to king's knight 3 or king 3. Well, now it seems Portish was getting rather unhappy with his position. It's very passive, and White might be going pawn to queen 5 at some point, and queen to queen 2, and maybe knight to queen 4, and knight on bishop 5, if black gets in pawn to queen 5, is rather sort of hanging around. It could get into a bit of a mess there. So Portish now played 15, pawn to queen 4. But this is the wrong time in which to make the position sharp, because his pieces aren't well placed for what follows. Karpov now played knight to king 5, and Portish played pawn takes pawn, and now we come to diagram 1. Switch off your cassette and see if you can find Karpov's next few moves, which left him with an easily winning position. Well, I hope you found it. Karpov played 16, knight takes bishop, and White played knight takes knight. As you might have guessed, Michael Basman just knocked all the pieces over. I just nearly did now as well. See, he has to make the moves while I'm reading it out to make sure I don't read too fast so you can't follow. Well, now you can see the basis for a combination here, because White's got the knight at queen 2 pinned. He's also got the knight at king's bishop 5 sort of hanging around in mid-air. So black can take advantage of this by playing queen to knight 4. This is what you had to see when I asked you to switch off. The main point behind this is that if White now plays knight to king 3, Black has rook takes knight, and after pawn takes rook, queen takes pawn check, followed by bishop takes knight, which also forks both the rooks. We'll now return to diagram 1. And here we have knight takes bishop, knight takes knight, queen to knight 4, as you now know, and Portish played knight to queen 6. Karpov now played bishop takes knight, and Portish played knight takes bishop. Karpov now played bishop takes rook, the rook on king 1, and Portish took the bishop with the queen. And now switch off your cassette record and see if you found Karpov's next move. This is quite an easy one, so you all ought to be able to find this. Well, I hope you found rook takes pawn for black, rook takes king's pawn. Well, white now played queen takes rook, and black played queen takes rook check, and white played queen to bishop 1, and black played queen to queen 7, and white now played pawn takes pawn, which really isn't very good, because black has rook to queen's bishop 1, and now white can't stop rook to queen's bishop 8, winning the queen, so Portish resigned. It's rather odd to see someone as strong as Portish losing a game in 23 moves like this with white. Yes, that game was a tactical victory and was played in round 2. And now we're going to look at the game Karpov played in round 3, where he had white against Georgiou of Romania. As I only played 2 games, I had a lot of free time to watch the tournament, and I was able to walk around inside the playing area because I was a player. But for a lot of this game, I just sat watching. For a lot of this round, I just sat watching this one game with Jonathan Spielman, who also wasn't playing that day. And we were both very, very impressed by the way that Karpov makes this game look so easy, because Georgiou plays very plausible and regular moves, and Karpov just outplays him, and nobody's quite sure where Georgiou actually went wrong. Anyway, you can see for yourself and see what you think. This is round 3. Karpov is white against Georgiou. 1. Pawn to queen's bishop 4. Pawn to queen's bishop 4. Knight to king's bishop 3. Knight to king's bishop 3. Knight to queen's bishop 3. Black plays 3, pawn to king 3. White plays 4, pawn to king's knight 3. Black plays pawn to queen's knight 3. White plays bishop to knight 2, and black plays bishop to knight 2. This is rather interesting, as Karpov is playing the reverse side of the position he could have had against Portish the previous day. Karpov now played 6 castles, and Georgiou played bishop to king 2. And white played pawn to queen 4, pawn takes pawn, queen takes pawn, and black played pawn to queen 3. If instead of pawn to queen 3 black had played knight to queen's bishop 3. White plays queen to bishop 4, followed by rook to queen 1 and pawn to king 4. Okay, so put the queen back on queen 4 and the knight back on queen's knight 1 and play pawn to queen 3 for black. Karpov now played pawn to queen's knight 3 and Georgiou played castles. And now he played what seems to be almost a new move, rook to queen 1. Now previously it was thought necessary that when white's queen is attacked he has to put it back to king 3, or it's best to put it back to king 3. So it was previously thought that white needed the advanced pawn to king 4 in, so he could retreat the queen behind the pawn, and it was thought that the pawn on king 4 was necessary in order to cramp black. However, Karpov plays the position in a new way, where he, well, basically white has a space advantage in this position. It's quite hard to realise, but the position is difficult for black to play, because black has to sort of sit behind a defensive wall and sort of grovel around for a long time. But usually black managed to get some kind of break in, either with pawn to queen's knight 4 or with pawn to queen 4, and suddenly all his pieces explode into action. So white has to spend a lot of time before he actually starts advancing and trying to win the position, just holding black down and cramping him. And Karpov finds a completely new way of playing this position, whereby he exchanges a lot of pieces and then cramps black. And I imagine this is because that if black then manages to break out, his breakout, which may have been anti-positional breakout, loses a lot of its force, because a lot of the heavy pieces are exchanged off. Anyway, you'll see what I mean. Black now played 10, queen's knight to queen 2. White played bishop to knight 2, bishop to queen's knight 2, and black played pawn to queen's rook 3. He's preparing probably for the pawn to queen's knight 4 thrust later to try and free his position. White now played queen to king 3, and black played queen to knight 1. This move has three purposes. It takes the queen off the queen file while still defending the queen pawn, or while adding an extra defender to the queen pawn. It probably later prepares pawn to queen to knight 4, and it also defends the bishop on queen to knight 2. White now played 13, knight to queen 4, exclamation mark, and black played bishop takes bishop, and white played king takes bishop, and black now played queen to knight 2 check. And Georgiou is probably quite pleased because he's exchanging a lot of pieces, and he probably thought he was, by exchanging pieces, his pieces wouldn't be on top of each other so much, so he'd be giving them more room. But he seems to be doing exactly what Karpov wants. Karpov now played queen to bishop 3, and Georgiou played queen takes queen check, and Karpov played knight takes queen. Georgiou now played king's rook to queen's bishop 1, and Karpov played knight to queen 4. Well, we thought this was quite amazing at the time, because in the last 5 moves, Karpov moved his knight back and forward in 3 of them, and it's just to exchange a few pieces off. It seems very simplistic, but behind all this there's a very deep plan, and I think you should switch off your recorder now, and you should just look at the position and see how you think white should proceed in this position in order to realise his slight advantage. Yeah, this position is rather interesting because black's two main breaks. Well, black can hardly get in pawn to queen's knight 4 ever with no white squared bishop, and pawn to queen 4 just leaves him with an isolated queen pawn. So in this position where it's basically an ending, black really hasn't got any sort of active plan. He just has to sit behind this defensive wall, which is what he now proceeds to do. He played 17 queen's rook to queen's knight 1, and white played queen's rook to queen's bishop 1, and black now played pawn to king's rook 3. White played pawn to king 4, but only now does white start advancing. Black played knight to king 1, and white played pawn to bishop 4. Now you can see white sort of gradually increasing his spatial advantage. Black now played bishop to bishop 3. Now I think you should switch your recorder off, and you should again think about how white should proceed in this position with his plan. Well, white played 21 king to bishop 3 exclamation mark. You can see now that black's basically very squeezed, and he can't move very much in an active way. And now white's going to try and squeeze him as well as on the queen side and the centre. He's going to advance his king side pawn slowly and try and squeeze black on the other side as well. Black now played rook to knight 2, and Karpov played bishop to queen's rook 3. Well, Karpov's trying to put his pieces on their very, very best squares before he starts advancing. This bishop's is very well placed here. It's sort of looking at black's queen's pawn. Black now plays rook on knight 2 to bishop 2. And white plays knight on bishop 3 to king 2. Black plays knight to bishop 4. White plays rook to queen 2. This is always a good preparatory move in these kind of positions, because Karpov's leaving a lot of options open. He can double on the queen file, or he can at some point play rook to king's knight 1, and then later the other rook will be able to come to king's knight 2. So in all these positions, Karpov can always double on any file he wants quite quickly. Black now played pawn to king's knight 3. White played knight to bishop 2. And this is very strange. Black seems to be playing very, very plausible moves in this position, but slowly his position is getting worse and worse. Black now played bishop to knight 2, and white played knight to king 3. White's knights are now very well placed for kingside play. White's sort of regrouped his pieces into their best places, and he can double on the queen's file, or he can play pawn to king's knight 4, pawn to king's rook 4, and pawn to king's rook 5. And black just has to sit there. And over the board, this is a very, very difficult thing to do. It's just to sit in a very, very defensive position without doing anything. So Georgia now decided to try and get some kind of active play. So Georgiou played pawn to king's bishop 4, and white played pawn takes pawn, and black played knight's pawn takes pawn. Of course, king's pawn takes pawn would be ridiculous, because then white gets the queen 5 square for his knight. White now played pawn to king's rook 3. Black played pawn to king's rook 4. And white now played rook to king's knight 1, which is switching fronts now. Black now could see the danger coming from pawn to king's knight 4, so he decided that he's got to at least try and do something about it. So he now played rook to king's bishop 2, hoping that white won't play pawn to king's knight 4 because of pressure down the king's bishop file against his king. This is diagram 2 now. Karpov now played pawn to king's knight 4, exclamation mark. Georgiou played rook's pawn takes pawn. And Karpov played pawn takes pawn. And Georgiou played pawn takes pawn check. And Karpov now played rook takes pawn. Now, I think again you should switch off your recorder and look at this position, maybe as if you're playing it in a game, and you can see how white's plan has progressed from the earlier times when I told you to switch off. He's sort of methodically increased his advantage, and now his pieces are very, very well coordinated. Well, black now played king to bishop 1. This is to get his king off the knight file where white's rook is. And white played knight to knight 3. This is a very good move. So there's all sorts of possibilities. The main one is that the knight can be coming to rook 5, and then the rook on queen 2 can come to king's knight 2. Black now played pawn to queen's rook 4. Maybe black was frightened that white would play pawn to queen's knight 4 and start squeezing him on the other side of the board as well. Now I think you should again switch off your recorder and look at the position and see if you can see white's plan for finishing black off in this position. Well, white played rook to knight 6, and black played king to king 2, and white now played pawn to bishop 5. This is a very good move. It threatens bishop takes knight on queen's bishop 4, followed by rook takes pawn check. Now, Georgiou now played rook to king's bishop 3, which forces the exchange of rooks, and there's rook takes rook, and black plays knight takes rook. And Karpov now played rook to king 2, exclamation mark, and black played rook to king's bishop 1. It should be noted that pawn to king 4 for black would probably put up more resistance, but white's winning because black's bishop's very bad, and he has possibilities of bishop takes knight, followed by putting his knights on the white squares in the centre of the board. Anyway, black played rook to king's bishop 1, and Karpov now played bishop takes knight, which takes away the defence of the king's pawn, and Georgiou played knight's pawn takes bishop, and Karpov now played pawn takes pawn, which shows that the discovered threats along the f-file are not very dangerous, because they can always be answered by knight on king 3 to bishop 5 check, so that there's really no sort of attack along this file at all. It's amazing, Karpov's been able to keep his king here all the time, when it seems to be rather a dangerous place to keep it, but he has everything worked out so well that his king's never in danger at all. Georgiou now played king takes pawn, and Karpov played knight on king 3 to bishop 5 check. Georgiou now resigned. This move wins a piece because Georgiou has to play king to bishop 2, and now Karpov can play rook to king 7 check, followed by rook takes bishop check, and white's just a piece up, so Georgiou resigned. Now we're going to turn to look at the British players. And the best results by British players were scored by Webb and Nunn. Webb, as said before, just missed a board prize and played very solid games, but Nunn always played very, very interesting games. And the following game is very, very impressive indeed. And I think, had there been some best game prizes at the tournament, this would definitely have won one, if not the first one. And I also think that, assuming this game is published in Informata, it should win a prize for one of the best 10 games in that Informata. Anyway, this is the game Augustin Nunn. Augustin White plays 1, pawn to king 4. Nunn plays pawn to king 4. White plays 2, knight to queen's bishop 3. Black plays knight to king's bishop 3. White plays pawn to king's knight 3. Well, I know this is a personal opinion, but this variation has never really impressed me because it seems to be too passive a way to play with white. And well, what Nunn plays against it seems to be very strong. Nunn played bishop to bishop 4. White played bishop to knight 2. Pawn to queen 3. White played 5 kings, knight to king 2. Maybe knight to king's bishop 3 is better. Black played knight to queen's bishop 3. White plays castles. And black now plays pawn to king's rook 4. This is usually given a sort of mark with lots of exclamation marks, lots of question marks. It's usually meant to show that it's an interesting move. But I think this move should get an exclamation mark because it's not so unclear. It seems rather strong for black. And also these kind of positions where white's on the defensive very early on, black's got a big psychological advantage. And the positions are rather hard to defend with white. I think white should never give away the initiative at such an early stage unless he's got something for it. I mean, in the Benko Gambit, for example, white gives away the initiative, but white gets a pawn as well. But here, well, I don't like this position very much for white. White now played 7, pawn to queen 3. At Rosal in 64, this is the Russian chess magazine, suggests that white should instead play knight to rook 4. So that if bishop to knight 5, then pawn to queen's bishop 3, bishop to rook 4, pawn to queen's knight 4, bishop to knight 3, knight takes bishop, getting rid of black's dangerous bishop. Now reset the pieces. The white knight's at queen's bishop 3, the white's pawns queen's bishop 2 and queen's knight 2, and the black bishop's at queen's bishop 4. So white played pawn to queen 3, black played pawn to king's rook 5, and white played bishop to knight 5, black played pawn takes pawn, and white now played knight takes pawn, exclamation mark. If instead rook's pawn takes pawn, black has bishop to knight 5, white plays queen to queen 2, black plays queen to queen 2, white plays knight to queen's rook 4, and now black can play bishop to rook 6 with advantage, as black's opening bishop takes bishop, followed by queen to rook 6 check, and queen to rook 8 mate. Instead of bishop to rook 6, black could play bishop to bishop 6, and white's best is now bishop takes bishop, and after queen to rook 6, then bishop to rook 4, and the position's completely unclear. However, let's go back and play bishop to bishop 6 for black. And now if white plays knight to queen's rook 4, switch off your recorder and see if you can find out black's winning move. Well, black could play bishop takes bishop, king takes bishop, queen to rook 6 check, but then white has king to bishop 3. But black has a very clear win here with queen to rook 6, threatening queen to rook 7 check, and after bishop takes, bishop queen to rook 7 mate, after bishop takes queen, black has rook takes bishop, followed by rook to rook 8 mate. Okay, now go back to the position in diagram 3 after 9, knight takes pawn, exclamation mark for white. Black now played knight to queen 5, and white played knight to rook 5. And you can see the position is now beginning to get rather unclear. If instead of knight to rook 5, white had played knight to queen 5, then black can play pawn to queen's bishop 3, and after bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, knight to king 3. Black can play pawn to king's bishop 4, followed by queen to rook 5, which is very, very strong. Okay, now return again to diagram 3 and play knight to queen 5 for black and knight to rook 5 for white. Black now played knight to king 3. This position is diagram 4. Now, white's got a number of possibilities. If, for example, white plays bishop takes knight here, pawn takes bishop, knight to queen 5, black can play either pawn to queen's bishop 3, knight on queen 5 takes pawn, check, now king to bishop 1, and now black's threatening to play knight to bishop 5. In all these positions, the absence of a white squared bishop for white causes a black squared bishop for white causes him lots of problems. Okay, so return to diagram 4, and white plays bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, knight to queen 5, and now maybe black can play rook to king's rook 3. I hope the readers noticed that these are notes. This isn't what was played in the game. These are possibilities as to what could have happened in the game. Anyway, return to diagram 4. And white now played knight takes pawn check. And black played knight takes knight. And now white played knight to queen 5, which seems to regain the piece with a highly advantageous position, because if black plays knight on knight 2 to king's rook 4 to defend the knight, then white can play knight takes knight check followed by queen to bishop 3, which regains the piece. Now, after knight to queen 5, switch off your recorder and see if you can find black's rather stunning reply. Even when you found the reply, I think you should look at the position longer and see if you can see how black continues. Okay, black plays knight takes knight, double exclamation mark. White plays bishop takes queen. And black plays knight to bishop 5. White now plays bishop to knight 5. If instead bishop to bishop 6, then black has rook to king's knight 1, followed by knight to king's rook 4. Anyway, white played bishop to knight 5, and black now played knight on knight 2 to king 3. And white played bishop takes knight. Black played knight takes bishop, which threatens rook to king's knight 1. So white now plays king to rook 1. I think now it's time to take count of what's been happening in this position. For the sacrifice, black has got 2 pieces for a queen, but also white's king is very, very weak, and white's weak on the black squares, and also white's pieces are such that he can't really do anything active for a few moves. So black now, quite amazingly enough, has time just to simply develop the rest of his pieces for the attack on white's king. Oh yes, by the way, a lot of the analysis in this game, I was helped in analysing this game by Nunn, who showed me the game the evening after he played it. It shows the depth of Nunn's ability in this position, that he was able to conceive of the sacrifice and also see that he had enough compensation for it by just playing quiet moves in the position, which he now proceeds to do. He now played bishop to king 3. Nunn played bishop to king 3 with black. And this is now diagram 5. After bishop to king 3 for black, white now played 17, bishop to king's bishop 3. But now we'll look instead and see what happens. Place the bishop back on king's knight 2, and we'll see what happens if white instead plays pawn to queen's bishop 3. Black can quite simply play castle to queen side, and white plays pawn to queen 4. Black now plays rook to rook 5, exclamation mark. White plays pawn takes bishop. Black now plays rook on queen 1 to rook 1. White plays queen to bishop 3. Black plays rook takes pawn. White plays king to knight 1. Now switch off your recorder and see how black can win this position. Well, I hope you got it. Black plays rook takes bishop check, and after queen takes rook, he plays knight to king 7 mate. Okay, now return again to diagram 5. Now white's best, instead of bishop to king's bishop 3, seems to be queen to bishop 3. And now black can play king to king 2. Now white plays rook to king's knight 1. And black can now force a draw if he wants by rook takes pawn check. king takes rook, rook to rook 1 check, king to knight 3, rook to knight 1 check, and if king to rook 2, rook to rook 1 check. If white now plays king to knight 3, rook to knight 1 check, king to rook 4, black has bishop takes pawn check, exclamation mark, and after queen takes bishop, rook to knight 5 is mate. However, this variation only gives black a draw if white plays properly. So again return to diagram 5. Okay, so return to diagram 5, and we discover that white's best seems to be queen to bishop 3. And now black played king to king 2, and white played rook to king's knight 1. Now previously black forced a draw with rook takes pawn check, but maybe he can try for more with rook to king's rook 3. White now plays bishop to king's bishop 1. Black plays queen's rook to rook 1. White now plays queen to knight 3. And black now plays bishop to knight 5, exclamation mark. Bishop to king's knight 5. Now white has to play rook to king's knight 2. Black was threatening bishop to bishop 6 check. Black plays knight takes rook. Black plays bishop takes knight. And black now plays rook to king's knight 3. And it seems to me as black is winning this position. He's got so many different threats. Bishop to king 7. He's got all the black squares in the position. It's a very difficult position for white to have to play. Okay, so now we'll return to the game after this sort of long digression, and we'll go back to diagram 5. I do hope diagram 5 comes out okay, otherwise you'll have some problems. Anyway, diagram 5, white now plays 17 bishop to king's bishop 3. And black plays rook to rook 5, exclamation mark. White now plays rook to king's knight 1, and black played king to king 2. It's rather nice. Black's just sort of developed his pieces slowly, and white can't do anything to stop them. White now plays rook to knight 2. If instead rook to knight 3, then black has bishop takes bishop's pawn. After rook to knight 2, black plays knight takes rook. White plays bishop takes knight. Black plays rook on queen's rook 1 to king's rook 1. White now played queen to queen 2. Black played rook takes pawn check. White played king to knight 1. Black played rook on rook 7 to rook 5. White played rook to king 1. And black played rook to king's knight 1, which threatens the rook on rook 5 going to king knight 5, winning the bishop. And if king to bishop 1, then black has rook to rook 7, which is winning. So white now played rook to king 3. And black played bishop takes rook. White played queen takes bishop. And black played bishop to rook 6. And white played king to bishop 1. Black played bishop takes bishop check. White played king to king 2. It's very nice. Black, after originally only having 2 pieces with the queen now has 2 rooks and a piece with the queen, and the rest of the game's rather easy. After king to king 2, none now played pawn to queen's bishop 4, and white played queen to queen 2, and none played pawn to queen's knight 3, and white played queen to bishop 3, and none played rook to bishop 5, and white played queen to rook 3, and black played pawn to queen's rook 4. White played queen to knight 3, black played bishop to rook 6, which threatens rook to knight 7. So white played pawn to king's bishop 3, none played rook to knight 7 check. Augustine played 33 king to king 3, and none played bishop to knight 5. Augustine now resigned, as after pawn takes bishop, black has rook on knight 7 to bishop 7, which forces mate by rook on 5 to bishop 6 check.
And now, from our treasure house of missed opportunities, we are going to look at the game Steen-Padevsky.
Steen is white against Padevsky. 1. Knight to king's bishop 3, pawn to queen's bishop 4. 2. Pawn to queen's bishop 4, knight to king's bishop 3. 3. Knight to queen's bishop 3, pawn to queen 4. 4. Pawn to king 3, pawn to king 3. 5. Pawn to queen 4, knight to queen's bishop 3. Pawn takes pawn, bishop's pawn takes queen's pawn, knight takes pawn, knight takes pawn. 7. Bishop to queen 3 for white. Black plays pawn takes pawn, white plays pawn takes pawn. Black plays bishop to king 2. Both sides castle, move 9. White plays 10, rook to king 1. Black plays knight on queen's bishop 3 to knight 5. White plays bishop to queen's knight 1. This is a very, very typical sort of isolated queen's pawn position where white tries to attack black's king side and black tries to surround the white's queen pawn. And in the following moves you'll see both sides carrying out their plans, but white carries out his plan in a rather more effective manner. Black now plays 11, pawn to queen's knight 3. White plays knight to king 5. And black plays bishop to knight 2. White now plays 13, pawn to queen's rook 3. Black plays knight takes knight on queen's bishop 3. White plays pawn takes knight on queen's bishop 3. Black plays knight to queen 4. White plays queen to queen 3. Black plays knight to king's bishop 3. Stop mate on king's rook 7. White now plays queen to king's rook 3. And black plays rook to king 1. White now plays bishop to king's knight 5, which threatens bishop takes knight, followed by queen takes rook's pawn check. So black has to play pawn to king's rook 3. Michael Steen now played bishop takes rook's pawn, exclamation mark. and black played pawn takes bishop, and now white played rook to king 3, and black played pawn to king's rook 4. This is the position in diagram 6, and will you now switch off your recorder and see if you can find how white should have won. Well, white now forced to draw, missing his opportunity, with 20 queen to rook 4, and black played bishop to queen 3, white played queen to knight 5 check, king to bishop 1, now white played knight to knight 6 check, black has to play pawn takes knight, white now plays queen to rook 6 check, black plays king to knight 1, white now plays queen takes pawn check, king to bishop 1, queen to rook 6 check, and white now draws by perpetual check, as black can't play king to king 2 because of queen to knight 7 check. However, return to the position in diagram 6, and I don't know, I mean, Steen missed it over the board. It's a rather difficult one to find, but I hope you found it. White could have won with 20, bishop to knight 6, exclamation mark. Now, if rook to king's bishop 1, then white has simply bishop takes rook's pawn, and black's king is stripped of all its defences. And if pawn takes bishop, then white has queen takes pawn check. If now king to knight 2, white has queen to bishop 7 check, queen to bishop 7 check, and mate with either queen takes pawn check or knight takes pawn mate. So black has to play, after queen takes king's pawn check, he has to play king to rook 1. White now can either play knight to bishop 7 check, which wins the queen, or he can play knight takes pawn check, king to knight 2, knight takes bishop, with a winning attack. Now we're going to look at the look at a position from the game Georgiou Hartston, which was played in round 1, and for this, turn to diagram 7. Black has just captured a piece on f4, and now white has to decide whether to take it back or whether he has something better. Switch off your recorder and see if you can find out what's white's best in this position. Well, I hope you found it. White now played 15 pawn to queen 6, exclamation mark. This opens the line for the queen against f7, and also the bishop on b7 is attacked. So black is forced to play bishop takes bishop. And white now plays knight takes king's bishop pawn, which wins the queen, as white is not only threatening to take the queen, he's also threatening knight to rook 6 check, king to rook 1, queen to knight 8 check, rook takes queen, and knight to bishop 7 mate. So black plays bishop to queen 4. And white plays knight takes bishop, and black plays knight on bishop 5 takes knight. And Georgiou now played knight takes queen, and Hartson played bishop takes knight. And Georgiou now played king's rook to king 1. And after rook takes rook check, rook takes rook, Hartson as black now played pawn takes pawn. Georgiou now played rook to king 6, and there's a rather hard struggle ahead because black has got 3 pieces for the queen and they're well placed. However, instead of rook to king 6, switch off your recorder and see if you can find how white could have won quicker. Well, white should have played pawn to king's knight 4, threatening pawn to knight 5. This move seems to win a piece. For example, if black plays pawn to king's rook 3, white plays pawn to king's rook 4. And if black now plays pawn to king's knight 4, white plays pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, and pawn to king's bishop 4. And after pawn takes pawn, plays pawn to knight 5, which wins a piece due to the unfortunate position of black's knights. And now we're going to look at a rather instructive ending. This is the game Belin v Bukic. Bukic is the GM, and we're going to look at it from the adjourned position. In the adjourned position, white now sealed 41, rook to king 1. And black now played pawn to king's bishop 4 check. This is forced. If instead black had played bishop to queen 5, then white has either pawn to bishop 5 to bishop 6 check, or pawn to queen 3, followed by knight to queen 2 to bishop 4, and white's knight's clearly dominating the bad bishop then. So black played, return black's bishop to queen's rook 1, and black now played pawn to king's bishop 4 check. White played pawn takes pawn en passant. Black played bishop takes pawn. White now played knight takes bishop. King takes knight. White now played rook to king 6 check. Black played king to bishop 2. White played king to knight 5. Now, of course, we'd all helped Robert analyse this adjourned position, but nobody was quite sure what was black's best here. But maybe rook to knight 7 is black's best. What black does, though, is he loses a tempo in a rather silly way. He plays rook to knight 5 here. Rook to knight 7 is better, though white still retains chances with rook takes pawn, rook takes queen's pawn, rook takes queen's pawn, rook takes queen's pawn for black. White now plays rook to queen 7 check, king to king 1, rook to queen's rook 7, black plays rook takes pawn check, and white plays king takes pawn. And white has some winning chances here. Now return to the position in diagram 9 and play rook to knight 5 for black. White now played rook to bishop 6 check, exclamation mark, and black has to play king to king 2. White now plays king takes pawn, and black plays rook to queen 5. Black has to play this. Black can't play rook takes rook's pawn because then white has rook to king 6 check, and after king to queen 2 has pawn to bishop 5 to bishop 6 to bishop 7, winning. So black plays rook to queen 5, white now plays rook to king 6 check, and black played king to queen 2. If instead of this black had played king to bishop 1, White can play pawn to bishop 5, and after rook takes queen's pawn on queen 5, on d5, white plays rook to king 2, which is winning. White just advances bishop's pawn and has all sorts of mating threats. So return white's rook to king 6, white's pawn to queen 5, and black's rook to d4, and play king to queen 2 for black. Now white played pawn to bishop 5, and black played rook takes pawn on d2. If instead rook takes pawn on d5, then white has rook e2 again winning, which is even stronger because the black king is cut off from defending against the pawn. However, this is rather silly because black's now wasted a vital tempo, because instead of going rook to knight 7 takes pawn on d2, he's gone rook to knight 5 to queen 5 takes pawn on d2, and so he's lost a tempo, and in this kind of position that's absolutely vital. Berlin now played 50 pawn to bishop 6, so that if rook takes pawn, then pawn to bishop 7. So black now played rook to knight 7 check. White played 51 king to rook 7, rook to rook 7 check, now king to knight 7, rook to knight 7 check, and now king to bishop 8. Black now played pawn to bishop 5, white played rook to king 7 check, black played king to queen 1. Now switch off your cassette and see if you can find what white's winning move should have been. Well, white should have played here rook to knight 7. For example, if then, rook to king's knight 7. If then rook to bishop 7, then pawn to bishop 7, pawn to bishop 6, king to knight 8, pawn to bishop 7, and now rook to king's knight 1. And now all black can do is go rook to king's knight 7 check. But after rook takes rook, pawn equals queen, white queens with check, and then it's all over. Now return to the position in diagram 10. White now played 55 rook to king 3. And black played rook to knight 5. Question mark. Much better was rook to knight 4. So now if pawn to bishop 7 for white, black has king to queen 2. And we have the following sort of variations. Rook to queen's bishop 3, rook to knight 5, and after rook to rook 3, rook to king's rook 3, black has rook to knight 4. And now it's very hard to make progress because white can't get his king out to help the pawn queen. So return to diagram 10 again. And we have other possibilities. After rook to king 3 and rook to knight 4, pawn to bishop 7, king to queen 2, now rook to king's rook 3, now king to queen 1, And now if rook to rook 8, then black has simply pawn to bishop 6, and white's king's completely trapped. If now rook to knight 8, then pawn to bishop 7, rook takes rook, pawn to bishop 8 equals queen. And now white isn't winning. For example, white has either, well, if white goes now rook to knight 7, black has queen to queen 7, so as to answer king to knight 8 with queen takes queen's pawn, stopping the pawn from queening. Or if perhaps instead of rook to knight 7, rook to knight 6, black again plays queen to queen 7, and if king to knight 7, then queen to queen 5 check, and if rook to bishop 6, then queen to knight 5 check, and this position seems only to be a draw. So now, return to the position in diagram 10 again. So black, instead of rook to knight 4, played rook to knight 5. White now played 56, pawn to bishop 7. Black played king to queen 2. White played rook to queen's bishop 3. Black played king to queen 1. White now played rook to king's rook 3. And now black played king to queen 2, which is a losing move. He should have instead played rook to knight 4, as in the previous example. Now white wins with rook to king's rook 8, pawn to bishop 6, rook to king's knight 8, pawn to bishop 7. Now black played pawn to bishop 7. Had black instead of this played rook to bishop 5, white has the following nice way of winning. King to knight 7, threatening to queen, so rook to knight 5 check. Now king to rook 7, rook to rook 5 check, king to knight 6, pawn to bishop 7, pawn to bishop 8 equals queen, rook to knight 5 check, king to rook 5, rook takes rook, and now the very nice queen to bishop 7 check, which picks up the rook with check, and then white brings his queen back and stops black's pawn. Now return your pieces to diagram 11 and play pawn to bishop 7 for black. White now played rook takes rook, exclamation mark. Black played pawn equals queen. White played king to knight 8. Black played queen to queen 8. Now switch off your cassette recorder and see if you can find white's winning move. Well, white now played pawn to bishop 8 equals queen, exclamation mark. I hope you found it. Black played queen takes rook check. White plays queen to knight 7 check. Queen takes queen check, king takes queen. It's a one king and pawn ending. This is a very nice finish. Black plays king to bishop 2. White plays king to bishop 7. Black plays king to knight 3. If instead king to queen 2, then white has king to bishop 6, king to bishop 2, and king to king 6, or king to king 7. but white can always win by triangulating in the ending. So black played king to knight 3, white plays king to king 7, black plays king to bishop 4, white plays king to king 6, which is Zugzwang. Black now has to move away. Whoever moves in this position loses, but it's black to move. Black played king to knight 5, white played king takes pawn, black played king takes pawn, white played king to bishop 5, and black resigned as white queens first. Well, there's a little time left, so I think I'll make some concluding remarks. I enjoyed very much the opportunity to play in Moscow, and this was the first time I'd played for an English team. And one thing I noticed very clearly, while I was playing in Lone Pine in California, one of the American juniors, John Fedorovitz, said to me that the English team sounded like they were one happy family. And of course every team has its problems, but relative to other teams I thought the team got on very well. The atmosphere was very nice in the team, and I enjoyed the whole atmosphere. Even when we were under pressure, people stayed very friendly. When there were troubles, the captain David Anderton proved very effective, and tension was resolved quite easily, and David Anderton was a very, very good captain, and I think we were all very happy with him. It seems as if Karpov's result in Moscow makes it look as though it's very difficult for anyone to challenge him for the World Championship, as his game with Portish indicates. But I actually suspect that Korchnoi has quite a good chance against him. Of course, apart from the games that we fitted on the tape here, there are a lot of other interesting games that were played at Moscow, and some of them will be included in the pamphlet that goes with this cassette, so you'll have other games to look at as well as the games on this cassette. I'm sorry if at times the atmosphere degenerates a bit in the recording studio, but I and Michael Basman actually find it quite hard to sit here for 90 minutes just reading something out and playing moves over. But I hope it adds to the atmosphere of the cassette. If you have any questions about the cassette, then you can always contact me at 1 Birkbeck Road, Birkbeck Road, Acton, London W3, and my phone number is 992, it's 01 992 9100, and I'm also available to give lessons on cassette for anyone who wants. Well, I have enjoyed making this cassette. We've enjoyed making this cassette, and I hope you enjoy listening to it.